Before we begin, I want to give a big shout out to Dollar Shave Club for sponsoring this video. So there are a few topics that I wanted to make videos about for a while, but I've just been hesitant. And this could happen for various reasons, like maybe I need to do a little more research, or maybe I'm not sure where I stand on the issue. But some of them, I think about the potential response that I might get, and I'm just like, I really don't want to deal with that. This is definitely one of those videos. But if there's anything I've learned on YouTube, is that you can't really predict how your videos are gonna be perceived. So I'll just try to be thoughtful as always, and whatever happens, happens. Hi, I'm T1J.
Follow me.
All right, let's check the voicemail.
Hey T1J, this is Chris from Oregon, and I just want to know what your thoughts are on reparations for African Americans. Thank you. Bye.
So first of all, what are reparations? The basic idea is that some form of compensation for slavery and discrimination should be made to Black Americans, particularly those who are descendants of slaves. Some people propose a direct payment from the government and or private institutions that were involved with oppressing Black Americans, while others call for things such as no-cost tax-free education, healthcare, legal aid, things like that. This has been proposed, if not demanded, in several countries, but I'm going to speak mostly from a United States perspective in this video. Some people talk about reparations as if it's some kind of impractical fantasy, but there are precedents. For example, in 1988, the United States granted $20,000 in compensation to each surviving Japanese American who had been held in internment camps during World War II. And Germany continues to this day to pay reparations to Holocaust survivors. Now, a lot of times people frame this as reparations for slavery, but it should be made clear that slavery is just one of the offenses. Black Americans have had to endure Jim Crow laws, police brutality, and other kinds of legalized violence, redlining leading to lower standards of education and housing, and suppression of voting rights and freedom of expression, among many other forms of systemic oppression, the effects of which still persist. So the debate about reparations for Black Americans is in some ways very simple, but in other ways very complex. I say simple because a lot of the people who outright oppose any form of reparations are also people who deny the still existing legacy of racism and discrimination in America. So essentially, people who are either ignorant or in disbelief of verifiable data about social and economic disparity when it comes to race. So to put it more bluntly, people that don't believe facts. Isn't that right, Sir Applesauce? So in that way, it's kind of like people who oppose vaccinations because they don't believe that vaccines actually prevent disease. It would be kind of a waste of time, in my opinion, to start a discussion about reparations if half the people involved don't even believe the facts around the issue. So assuming that you understand that Black Americans and their ancestors lived through centuries of slavery, followed by decades of legal systemic oppression, followed by even more decades of technically illegal but still very much present oppression, that, although we have made progress, still continues to this day. Unless you're an awful person, you probably agree that if there's something that can be done to make up for all that, then we should probably do it. But that's when things start getting complicated. Because when we're talking about reparations, we need to decide who will receive the reparations, who will pay the reparations, and how much they'll pay. So you could make a very solid argument that slavery is the very root of systemic racism against Black people in America, even though it was abolished a long time ago. Slavery established the precedent of Black people being less human and thus less worthy of respect and trust than white people, which is a sentiment that carried on through history and one that I'd argue still persists. This is one reason why discussions of reparations often focus on slavery. So in order to provide fair reparations for slavery specifically, potential recipients would have to prove that they were in fact a descendant of an African slave, which I'm not sure is even possible for some people depending on what records are available. And that kind of thing usually isn't free anyway. Although I guess that whomever is providing the reparations could, as part of the compensation, hire professional genealogists to work with people. But then that brings up the matter of who actually has to pay the reparations. The easiest answer is the government, but One could argue that the United States government shouldn't totally be on the hook for paying reparations because they didn't institute slavery. And in fact, the United States government did not exist for most of it. Although it's not like the slavery industry slowed down after the Declaration of Independence was signed. In fact, it's very much the opposite. It's also true that many non-government organizations and individuals contributed to and profited from slavery. For example, some banks used to accept slaves as collateral for loans. A couple of those banks actually were absorbed into what is now JP Morgan Chase, who apologized for this in 2005. So if we're going to be fair, we're going to have to account for all of that as well. And as you know, if the government is paying for something, then that means essentially the taxpayers are paying for it. And one might argue that it is unfair to place the burden of paying for reparations on people who had nothing to do with slavery. And then of course there is the question of how much will be paid. In the 90s, Harper's Magazine estimated that between the years of 1619 and 1865, slaves were subjected to approximately 222 million hours of forced unpaid labor, which they figured with compounding interest would come out to about $100 trillion in owed wages, which if you don't know is more money than there is in the world. It's gonna be pretty tough to pay that one out. All of this is to say, I really don't think there's any practical way to tackle the issue of reparations for slavery by just handing out checks to black people who are descendants of slaves. It's something that should have been done very soon after slavery was abolished, but now it's just completely unfeasible. There are just too many factors involved that would make the process impossible to carry out in a fair and efficient way. And keep in mind, thus far, I've focused on compensation for slavery. But as I said, black people have been subjected to over a century of racism and discrimination even after slavery ended. A lot of people scoff at the idea of reparations because it sounds like people are asking for a handout. I scoff at the idea because there will probably never be enough money in the world to make up for the amount of atrocities that black people have had to face in this country. And this is a thing that I hesitate to say sometimes because I know it sounds like an exaggeration to some people. This is actually one of the problems you get when you're trying to talk about issues that marginalized people face. It's hard to talk about real stuff without sounding alarmist or sensationalist or being perceived as the stereotypical angry black person. But I mean, like, it's true though. Racism infects virtually every American institution. This entire country was built on the backs of slaves. Some of our grandparents were alive for Jim Crow. Getting $1 million check would be cool for a generation or two, but it wouldn't fix systemic racism, so it wouldn't solve the problem. It would do little to combat the enduring discrimination within our institutions, which is the true cause of social and economic disparity. But I'm not saying that nothing should be done. One cool thing that many states and localities did was pass disclosure legislation, which required businesses to research and disclose their historical ties to racism and slavery, and then publicly report on their efforts to reverse the effects. In fact, that's exactly what happened with JP Morgan Chase, and in response, they set up a $5 million scholarship for students in the area affected by those banks. Now, of course, that's a pretty small step for a company that large, but I would like to see more things like that. In reality, there's no one lump sum that would suffice to tackle this problem. It's much more likely that each institution and each organization and each individual will have to personally take stock of how much they and those that came before them contributed to and benefited from the legacy of racism in America, and then take steps to start compensating for that in a way that makes sense for them. This can be forced to some extent through legislation or judicial action, and in the cases where it can be, I fully support that. For example, I support financial reparations for the families of black people who were unjustly murdered by the police. But you can't legislate away the negative stereotypes and unconscious biases that led to the killings in the first place. The reparations that I want is a pledge from the organizations and people that matter in this country, including the government, that they will make a conscious attempt to research and learn how they can help compensate for and reverse the effects of systemic racism. And then I want them to actually start doing it. And I don't think that's an impractical fantasy. I think it's something that could happen. But I'm also not holding my breath. That's just me though. What do you think? I'd like to thank Dollar Shave Club for sponsoring this video. You may have heard of Dollar Shave Club. It's that company that sells razors and shaving products, right? Well, that's what I thought too. And in fact, I was hesitant at first to even do this because I don't really even use razors, as you can probably tell from my unkempt facial hair. But come to find out, Dollar Shave Club sells all kinds of grooming products, hair products, skin products, shower products, oral care products, and better grooming of my body is actually one of my New Year's resolutions, so I was pretty excited to find that out. So Dollar Shave Club has this great deal where you can get the shave, oral, or shower starter sets for just $5 each. They graciously sent me all 3 of the starter sets, and I was most excited to try the shower starter set, which includes the shampoo, the body wash, and the facial cleanser. Because honestly, I normally don't think about this sort of thing that much. I usually just kind of buy whatever, so I was enthusiastic about trying something new. I especially enjoyed the face cleanser. It's citrus Hawaiian ginger. It made my face feel all soft and clean. It smells good too. So go ahead and go to dollarshaveclub.com/T1J and grab 1 or more of the $5 starter sets. And after that, if you love it, you can continue the subscription and get regular size products at regular prices. And keep in mind, when you support sponsors like Dollar Shave Club, not only do you get great products, but you also support me and this channel and these videos, which, let's just say, has a high risk of being demonetized by YouTube. So thanks again to Dollar Shave Club.